for joining us. I'm Mark Arajan with 21st Century, and we're excited to run back one of our most popular webinars during our virtual roadshow in October. I have Ryan Handrahan here, and I don't know if Nick and Roger are on here. It may just be Ryan with Sonos. And for the next 45 minutes to an hour, Ryan is going to take a deep dive into everything from spanning tree protocol to using managed switches, advanced home theater installation, and how to anticipate network challenges. Like I said, this recording or this webinar is being recorded and will be available for all of you guys to rewatch in our virtual conference center, or if you want a fellow teammate to watch this after the fact, it will be in our virtual conference center on our website. If there are any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I'll get them answered. The best question asked here today will receive an Era 300. So I guess make it a good one. So without further ado, Ryan, why don't you go ahead and take it away? And like I said, if everybody wants to open up Ryan's window, you'll be able to see it a lot more clearly.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, 21st Century. Before we dive into the networking training, we do have a really amazing new product that we're launching in the next couple weeks here. The new expansion on the Sonos architectural line, in that a 8-inch in-ceiling speaker. The goal of this speaker was that, looking at the entire landscape of passive in-ceiling speakers, 6-inch takes up about 55% of it, but 8-inch speakers take up another about 45%. So we saw an opportunity to not only cover the majority of the market, but also deliver an incredibly compelling and powerful speaker. But moving into the meat and potatoes of today's presentation, networking configuration. This is our most popular training by far, really detailing and instructing installers how to properly configure and set up a Sonos system to work, in anybody's home. Before we dive in, my name's Ryan Handrahan. I've been at Sonos for over 12 and a half years. Safe to say, I know a lot about this content. So when Mark was talking about how we're giving away an Era 300 to the best question at the end, you can throw some questions at me. I'm probably going to know them. And if I don't know them, I have the tools to be able to look it up and find those answers. Our goals for today: some key takeaways, working with wired versus wireless configurations, how to disable channels and disable Wi-Fi, or manage wireless channels and Wi-Fi, the deep importance of STP, some opportunities to screen capture, different settings for managed switches, and then just the different ways of configuring. The reason why we talk about this, though, is because Sonos, as a premium consumer electronic company, we want this to be as close to a plug-and-play experience as physically possible. We take a very complex idea and make it seem easy. So whether it's you, the installer and dealer, putting these products in customers' homes, or somebody who just wants to add something to themselves, we have to make it as simple as possible, being that premium electronic. But at the end of the day, Sonos is just a networked audio product. So you need a quality network to properly function. And you, as that professional installer, understand the intricacies of how this works and what's required for the install to work smoothly for your customers. And think about all the details that go into a good home system. You could play music in the kitchen while watching a movie in the living room, something else completely going on upstairs, and each room has its own individualized volume control. Think about all the details that go into the Sonos app, updating every single one of those metrics, getting the proper metadata for all of those different rooms, songs, buffering, making sure things aren't mixing up. Customers expect it to be easy, and we know the back end is very complex. You and I both know how much networking and processing is required to make this work. So Sonos requires a strong backbone, and we're going to be talking about how to build strong networks to give your customers that best experience possible, no matter the environment. And you, as the installer, make this complex work something your customer never has to think about. And when it's done properly, your customer's never going to think about it. Your customer's just going to be thrilled all the time to be using their system and enjoying what they're using. Anybody can walk into a big box retailer to buy Sonos, but you, the installer, make this experience optimal for the client. Not just with music, but their entire smart home of products. All these things are going to be working together and flawlessly so that they never have issues. They're never calling you with issues to roll a truck, and never calling a customer care channel to troubleshoot something they don't understand. So today we're going to give you that guidance on how to best configure a network with Sonos. So let's get started through the basics of setting up Sonos regarding a network and tips on how to configure it optimally. What we're going to be doing is we'll cover some things that are required at a minimum, some things that are important, maybe things that aren't recommended, and then things that aren't just straight up not supported. At a minimum, you're going to want to have a Wi-Fi router. You're going to want to have high-speed internet, whether it's a fiber line, DSL. The more high width traffic the more high bandwidth traffic you're playing, the more important the connection is to your network. You're also going to need that all Sonos products and the Sonos app are on the same VLAN with support for STP, especially for more advanced hardwired systems. Regardless of what you're using, a Sonos household maxes out at 32 Sonos devices, not 32 rooms. So if you're planning on putting up multiple home theater systems with a ARC, sub, and 2 rears, that's 4 products per home theater. And obviously you get up to about 8 there before you're running out of room within that single system. There are ways to not bypass this, but when you hit that 32 device maximum, you can introduce a new VLAN and then have different zones for that multiple Sonos households. We can dive into more of those details at another time, but that's how you build those really, really big systems. But typically we're talking commercial environments anyways. And then the more bandwidth, the more that's needed. So it's important to have that conversation with your client to understand what's needed from them. And then they can, you can determine what is the best scenario for them. Regardless, when you're setting up a system, we tend to avoid things like satellite internet. This guidance was created a few years ago, so we may update this guidance as things like Starlink get better and better and more reliable. But when it comes to things like satellite internet or hotspots and satellite or cellular internet, you typically have more limitations to those networks than you would with a more traditional line, whether it is a data cap, whether it's the extended ping required to connect to the network and really communicate across that, which introduces new latencies, new issues. You're going to run into troublesome situations here, and especially where something like music is important to be in sync and update as soon as the person hits play on the app or drags the volume control up. That latency is going to be an experience miss for the client. So we tend to not recommend those systems, obviously knowing that there are times when you have no choice but to use those systems. And then it's important to just set the expectation with the client. What we don't support, though, are systems that have routers without internet. We experience these most often on maybe a yacht system where they're going out to sea for a few days or weeks at a time. And when you're out to sea and you have zero internet available to you, it's great if your phone and your system are on the same app version, you're streaming from a local library, having a great time, but then you come to port and your Sonos app connects to the internet, updates to a version that's incompatible with the system that's on board. All of a sudden you're running 2 different versions, an older version on the boat and the newer version on your phone. They become incompatible and it doesn't work any longer. That becomes an experience miss for the client, and then they're troubleshooting, trying to figure out how to get music while they're in the middle of nowhere. So that's why we don't support that in any related style system where your router without internet for extended periods of time becomes a network block. Guest and shared Wi-Fi networks and things that require a splash page, WPA2 enterprise systems, This is because they're great for security systems. They're fantastic at limiting the communication between players, preventing a what the news would call bad actor from communicating and getting into different systems. But that limitation of communication between those devices is exactly what Sonos needs to be functional on a system. A player wants to talk to the other player to share buffering data, to share volume status across those different rooms. So if you're using a guest network and trying to put Sonos on it, Sonos isn't able to communicate, it's not going to work. Same thing with splash pages. There's no screen on a Sonos player to add them to a network. You would want to have them on a separate VLAN that is able to communicate, and then that way you can maybe dedicate a controller device like an iPad to that network and does nothing but the Sonos app, and then that way they can still control it. When you are setting up these systems, we do have all the modern Wi-Fi modes and security standards on here. You can see our newest products like the Era 100, 300, and Move 2 all support Wi-Fi 6, Wi-Fi 5, N and A. Older products, or just not as modern products, still support N, A, and even our oldest products still support 802.11a, where everything still supports WPA3. So, whoa, what happened here? Something crashed. Give me a second. We're having all sorts of technical fun today. Cool. All right, so with that, we're still supporting all of the modern Wi-Fi standards. So whether it's security-based or the most modern communication between routers and Wi-Fi speeds, we support all of those. So what's important here is that you know when you put a Sonos in a customer's home, it's going to work for an extremely long time. It's going to be supported for a long time. And even if you go in and swap out routing equipment, this is still backwards compatible. 802.11a is going to be on all Wi-Fi routers for even our oldest players, like a Play 3, which came out over 12 years ago now. So now that we understand the networking and the basics, what are we going to do when you see different kind of system for customers' home? 21st Century is great at giving you many options of control for your system, and we want to cover the three major ones that you're going to see here. Whether it's a basic or kind of an entry-level router, maybe the one that you're going in to either replace or set up as a temporary network while a customer's home is getting built. We refer to these as like a single AP within the home. Many of your jobs are now using mesh networks, so of course we're going to give guidance on those. And then managed networks, which are really popular for complex jobs, whether it's a residential or commercial system. Sometimes you're going to need more control, and that's totally cool. We're going to give you some high-level guidance on that as well. Regardless of which of these systems you're setting up, you're always going to have two ways of networking a Sonos system. You have a wireless setup, also known as a station setup, and a wireless setup on station, or a wired setup, also known as SonosNet. There are two very distinct differences with this, especially as we talk about individual products. Starting with a wireless or station mode setup, this is when you leave everything on wireless and Sonos communicates directly to an AP or the network, and all of those devices are not communicating over an Ethernet connection. This is going to be reliant on the Wi-Fi signal, so you want to make sure you're within range and have a solid connection to each of these. And when you are set up in a standard setup, the Ethernet ports are disabled on the rear of the device. A visual of how this may look is you have a router in a central location in the home. All of the players are within range and communicating back to this, and it's going to work fantastically from there. If you're using a mesh system and everything's on wireless, those mesh nodes will decide what's the cheapest path cost for the player and connect it directly to that AP. So this is where it comes into play that you may want to sell them on a a more high-end mesh system, not just a traditional mesh system, or like we covered earlier, not using range extenders because those are not mesh systems, but using a true mesh system that helps alleviate that network traffic and move from there. These wireless systems are great because they're the simplest setups. They're really easy and quick to do. So if you have you want to line up a few jobs in a single day, this creates a great opportunity for you to have multiple jobs in a single day because you're going in and out within a very short amount of time. You may also see a lot of success with these when you're using a mesh system specifically with a backhaul. I alluded that it's good to have a higher end system, higher end mesh system when you're using a wireless setup, and mesh systems with a backhaul are exactly that. What a backhaul is, for those who may not be familiar, is when you look at the technical specs of a mesh system or any router, really, you're going to see that 2.4, most often 5 gigahertz network for clients. You're going to have a 2.4 and a 5 gigahertz band for your system. Sometimes they're intermixed, sometimes they're separate. A backhaul is an additional 5 gigahertz channel dedicated for just communication between the APs. So when you're using a dual band system that's just 2.4 and 5, the backhaul will be shared across that 5 gigahertz network. However, if you give them if clients have a lot of networking traffic, something like a large Sonos system, that's when you want to consider that tri-band system. So you'll have a 2.4, a 5, and a separate 5. Front haul is handled by a 2.4 or 5 gigahertz, and then that third band of 5 gigahertz is going to be dedicated to the backhaul, alleviates a ton of traffic on the network, is a dedicated communication lane, so you're going to have a much larger and more future-proof system. As you can hear, I'm big on a mesh system with a backhaul. I currently use one at my house, and I've had zero issues with my Sonos system, even though I have many, many zones of Sonos. When we're talking about a wired setup, also known as the SonosNet setup, this is when you plug in one or more Sonos speakers and you create a dedicated mesh system for your Sonos system. This is a mesh system, not too different from a mesh system that we just talked about, but the difference is this is a little bit older. It's dedicated to a 2.4 gigahertz band because it's doing just music playback. And music does not need nearly as much data transmission as a traditional network, which may be supporting 4K Netflix, high-end YouTube audio, those different kind of codecs, which use many, many times the data that a even high-end high-res song would be playing. When you're using a SonosNet system, players can be about 50 feet away from each other, and that's typically the range of a 2.4 network in between the nodes. And then when you hardwire this, you do want to keep them about 3 feet away from each other. This being because when you have them less than 3 feet, you're going to have two devices broadcasting Wi-Fi in a very short amount of space, and you don't want those interfering with each other and creating a bubble of network energy, especially when they're competing for something like similar channel space. So you want to be able to move those around. These systems are great because they're the most reliable setup when all products are hardwired. Despite how good Wi-Fi has gotten over the years and it's super powerful and robust now, it still introduces variables that you just cannot account for. Wireless interference, materials of the home, things get in the way. And so when you hardwire all of those devices, you remove all of the variables that come with that, and it is just a more reliable network. This also allows you to have wired and wireless players because that SonosNet system that's created. And in most environments, it's going to be helpful in building those networks. The consideration, though, is that it does require a wiring to the network. So if your network drop is in a cabinet in the basement, that's not going to probably reach the top floor of the house, and it's not going to be a cure-all for entire systems. Like I said, this is going to be require hardwiring to the network. If it is in the basement, hardwiring your players is not going to necessarily reach the top floor. And also, it could be cost prohibitive if you're going to be installing a Sonos system, setting up this, and the materials of the building are pure concrete, and drilling holes, throughout all the walls of the place just isn't useful in creating a beneficial system. Lastly, one of the things to consider is our portable products, and our Era 100 family or Era family of speakers do not use SonosNet. This is just as we evaluate the market with newer products, the newest networking devices are even more powerful than SonosNet. So we've just moved away from SonosNet devices on certain products. But that being, we've created the network so that Sonos devices are going to be able to intermix across SonosNet, non-SonosNet, hardwired devices without any issue at all, and you won't even be able to notice performance changes.
Ryan, the most common wired products are, I would say, the amps, the ports, and then
correct.
Probably maybe the sound bars. But I mean,
absolutely,
right? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. You're not. I mean, I would think most integrators out there are not hardwiring. The fives, obviously the Eras, but the portable self amplified boxes. Speakers.
Yes, that's correct. We wanted to provide that. We wanted to highlight that the Era family and the portable products don't use it, in case you use something like I know Ubiquiti's system is really robust, and you can see where every node is, how it's connected, what AP it's connected to, and I wouldn't want an installer to be hardwiring every device on the network and then looking at that map and go, well, why isn't this player connecting? Must be a faulty Ethernet cable, must be something wrong with Sonos. Just I'm giving every tool out there so that the installer can make informed decisions. And that's always our goal. Or at least it's why I still have a job, because we're able to give out the information that you're not going to find publicly. But that goes similarly for things like channel settings. So if you are setting up a wired system, you're going to have two different channels that your Wi-Fi is being broadcasted on. In fact, you're going to have more than two channels that's broadcasting on. But for something like the 2.4 gigahertz, you're going to see your SonosNet system broadcasting on one channel, and then your house Wi-Fi broadcasted on another. This is when you want to open up a Wi-Fi analyzer tool, whether it's on your laptop, phone, different device, see the network, see how congested it is, and then look at which channels are being least utilized. So in your network, say you're in a high density area and you notice everybody's using channel 1 and maybe some traffic on channel 6, but channel 11 is pretty wide open. You're going to want to set the main network to a channel 11 and then move your Sonos to a channel 6. No matter what, your Sonos system and your network are going to be the two highest broadcasting things because they're in that home. So you want them on separate channels, but the two least traffic channels so that they have the most room to broadcast and get data across the entire network. In order to do that on a Sonos system, you go into Settings, System, Network, and you're going to see a SonosNet channel option. You can see here mine's grayed out because mine's actually on a wireless system. I'm not wiring my Sonos, but when it's wired, this becomes selectable and you can select which channel your network is on. Once you start hardwiring different devices to that network, though, you have the option of disabling the Wi-Fi. If you're a longtime Sonos installer, you may remember that you had to go into this old website and it technically disabled it voided the warranty. We knew installers were becoming more and more, were requiring this more and more often. So we built it into the settings of the system. Go into Settings, System, select the room, Product, and then Connection. And you can see here the ability to disable the Wi-Fi. If your product is on wireless, this won't let you disable the Wi-Fi. So you're not going to brick it. A kid's not going to dive into settings and disable it. But this option is there because it's going to be fantastic to alleviate wireless interference. So in a rack system, which we're covering here very shortly, in a rack system, if you have 10 Sonos devices all plugged into a network switch, all of them are broadcasting Wi-Fi energy for that SonosNet system. That's a waste of Wi-Fi energy. It's a waste of power use. It's going to create a lot of wireless interference because all of those devices are in such a short space. So you can disable all of those products from broadcasting. Maybe leave one on if you're using a SonosNet system for another player elsewhere, but you don't need to. And the only other time you would want to leave Wi-Fi on is if you're using a home theater system like an ARC hardwired to your system, but your sub and rears are on wireless. When you are going into that client's home and you want to switch out networks, maybe upgrade them from the ISP provided router to an actual networks system, or you had a temporary network in, the setup is super easy. Have the new network broadcasting on, leave the old network on as well, and just go into settings, system, network, and manage networks. From there, you could type in the new network and password. It will switch over to that network and update that way. And then you could turn off and remove the old network, turn it into bridge mode, the different functions that we all use. And then this way you can do that. If you were excited and already disabled the old network, which is something I commonly do because I'm not thinking about it, you still have the option. You'll just get an error code at the top of the Sonos app when you open it to switch networks to a new one. If you are switching to a managed network, really simple. Just plug in the Ethernet cable and it will automatically move over while still saving the old Wi-Fi, the old wireless network. But you can remove it from the managed networks page. Now, rack systems, something that we're all doing very, very well here, but giving the proper guidance on how to install these. It's important to know that when you're using a rack system, there's a lot of options for your system. We recommend individually hardwiring every player back to a singular switch and then have that switch with a single Ethernet cable back to the router. This way, when you are grouping different rooms, you're turning up the volume, all of those players are in extremely close proximity in terms of network hierarchy so that they can communicate buffering data, song metadata, making sure that when you hit group and group all the rooms together, the app is going to update as quickly as possible because there's such a less physical distance between those players. We know that this isn't always going to be the case. Sometimes you're going to have maybe 2 rack systems spread across each end of the house, or a business that requires, a front end and a back end system. It's not always going to be that way. This is when you're going to want to test the network, trial it out, and then show the customer the right conversation to make sure that they're not having an unreasonable expectation because you have 2 systems spread out across an entire distance with not only a large physical distance, but because those players are connected over Ethernet, there's a lot of different processing devices in between. So when you are doing something like maybe you have to daisy chain a system, it's important to know that 802.1d, which is classic SDP, the process Sonos uses, has a recommended bridge span limitation of 4 bridges, which is how many you can daisy chain for each spot. So you can see here, we have a switch to a single player, to a second player, to a third player. If we were to daisy chain all these, this could be considered a daisy chain of 3 bridges. You'd have 1, 2, 3. And then that way you can keep daisy chaining from there. If you run out of network switch availability, whatever the limitation is, you're not necessarily limited to telling the customer they have to get a new switch. If you just needed to daisy chain maybe 1 extra player because you ran out of switches, just know that each time that you request a new song, say our most extreme example, we want to play on this bottom Sonos amp. If it's daisy chained all the way through, you request a song to that, you're going to get it from the router to the switch, and then Sonos amp is going to have to process that data, send it to the next Sonos amp, which is also processing the data to the third amp to know that it's going to that one. And each time you add a few, milliseconds of latency to figure out where everything's going, making sure everything's functional, but those build up over time. And so if you have maybe a a lot of network traffic being used, Sonos amps playing something in another room, this amp's playing something in another room, you can see where that data is getting clogged up pretty quick. And that's why we have that limitation of 4, so that the experience doesn't get changed for your client. Now, when you are using STP, it's important to have this activated for your Sonos systems, because this does a lot of the heavy lifting for a Sonos network. STP monitors the topology of the network and will disable any redundancies. So this is going to help prevent things like broadcast storms, network loops, shutting down the network due to too many communication points between players. It's important to have STP turned on, and using this thing called BPDU frames, Bridge Protocol Data Units, which are sent out by default every 2 seconds to analyze and determine the optimal network. So in an example like this, we have a Sonos amp and port connected to a switch over Ethernet. And then you can see these other players shared between 2 APs from one giant gray circle to another. When you have STP, you're going to have path cost determined to help map out that topology. So an Ethernet is going to have a path cost of 10, the solid line here, and wireless is going to be a path cost of 150. With the path cost of the 150, you have the option, it will determine the best path for those different players. Without STP, there's no rules on how this all communicates with each other. So if you're requesting a song from the Sonos amp to the Sonos 5, without STP, you could get the song data transmitted over Ethernet, back to the wireless, up to this wireless, down to this wireless before it starts playing. STP determines which paths are redundant. So it will run a map every 2 seconds, understanding the connection between these players, and disable redundant links so that it's going to optimize the network traffic. In this example, as you may be able to guess, you can see that it will disable the wireless connection between the amp and the port here, the 5s in the port, and then the 5s and the single 5. There's no time where these connections would be more optimal than the existing connection between these players. So that way you want STP enabled, and it's going to help alleviate any issues that you may not have. Things that are worth considering: STP is not utilized by all of our products. You're going to see a theme here: our portables and Era family of products. For the same reasons, they don't use SonosNet, they don't use STP. And for the same reasons, if you use a wireless setup, you're not going to be using STP, because all the players are on wireless and there's no physical Ethernet connection to take hierarchy over a wired connection. That, with the exception of a home theater setup, because it is creating a dedicated network for just those players, so the ARC to the sub and rears, that will create its own little subnet, and in that case, it will be utilizing STP. Lastly, we've gotten some feedback about RSTP, Rapid Spanning Tree Protocol. This is a newer feature while still being backwards compatible with STP. We've done some studies, some analyzing. There's not a meaningful impact to a Sonos system. And because it's backwards compatible, we're not using RSTP. So if you are using RSTP routing, as long as you have the backwards compatibility turned on, you're going to be fine. Now, next 2 slides here are great for screen capture. These are the settings if you're using a managed switch in order to allow us to do the STP we need to do. So it's a good time to take a screenshot of this page. You can look at it on the recording later. It is on the Sonos website, although a little bit buried, but you can see here, you want to have spanning tree enabled, operation stage enabled, the BPDU handling set to flooding, and the path cost set to short. These are the optimal settings so that if you are using a managed switch, you can properly function your system. I know if you've called Sonos support in the past asking about managed switches, they're going to say it's not supported. That's just because it's our customer care team is trained to educate the layman customer who goes into like a big box retailer. And that's why we have jobs here as the training team because we know the ways around it and how to properly configure a network. Next slide worth screenshotting is for firewall ports. Similar situation if you're using a heavy firewall, you have a security conscious customer, that's fantastic. These are the ports that Sonos is using for different settings. You can see TCP/IP 3401 is the Sonos controller on iOS. You can see the UDP 6969 is for Sonos setup. So if you have a network already going, these are the ones that you're going to want to do. And if you see that port 6969 going off at 2 in the morning, it's not because somebody's breaking into the network. It's because Sonos automatic updates run overnight to not disturb the customer. So worth knowing these things. Last things worth knowing, things like AP client or wireless isolation. Use these things with caution. They're really nice for helping communication between different devices on the network. Not quite as hardcore as a guest network or a WPA2 enterprise, but it does limit the communication between different players and is quickly going to get in the way of Sonos. We don't recommend enabling them. If you do enable them and your Sonos system works fine, great. But this is one of those things where if this is enabled and you have a Sonos system with issues, this is most often the first culprit that we go after. Similarly with wideband Wi-Fi, this is a great feature that's going to broadcast on multiple channels. So it may broadcast on 6, but also reach 1 because it's broadcasting at maximum throughput. Great if it works, but in settings where you have something like maybe a high density living situation where you have many neighbors in an apartment building, this could get in the way of broadcasting very, very quickly. So we don't recommend it, but it's just worth something to note. Now, our last section before we dive into Q&A, home theater bonding. I'm going to give some guidance on to how to set up a proper home theater network. When you go into a home theater network, you're always going to have two different players. You're going to have a home theater primary and a home theater secondary. Home theater secondary are always your players like rears and your sub, where your home theater primary is always the one that's connected to the TV. This is important when it comes to wiring the different devices. When you're wiring home theater primaries and secondary players, you need the primary to have the top hierarchy so that it can communicate that data with the secondary players. So say you're wiring your Sonos system, you want to leave everything on wireless, that's totally fine. You can have everything on wireless. You're going to create that subnet for Sonos players, and the ARC is going to be able to send data to the rears, to the sub, all wirelessly and handle all network communication. You can also hardwire just the home theater primary. Home theater primary will get the network traffic data and then create that same 5 gigahertz network for the rears and the sub to communicate that data effectively. The last way you can do this is wire everything. So if you want to wire your home theater primary, communicates that data with another wired player. You could even leave the sub still on wireless because it's still a secondary player. So it doesn't have to be hardwired, but it can also be wireless. You could do all of that. What's important to note here is that you can't hardwire a secondary player while leaving your primary on wireless. Where we see this arise is if you're using a ARC in the living room or an amp is in a rack wired somewhere else. This is when you're going to run into issues because your amp is on a higher hierarchy priority than the Sonos ARC is. And the amp would be getting network traffic data before the Sonos ARC. We don't want that. So in these cases, you're going to want to hardwire the Sonos ARC as well. So that way they're at least on an even playing field. If you are running into these systems and you're building wireless setups, you can always go into the About My Sonos System and check for wireless mode. So you'll see on every single player, you'll have a WM0, 1, 2, or 3, and you can see whether it's in a wired setup, wireless setup, or bonded as surround, or bonded as surround but wired directly to the network. And WM3 is our newest one for players like Arrow 100 and 300 because they don't use a SonosNet style system. We're never done. We got next month's training. I'm sure we'll host this again for more dealers who want to attend. So there's going to be plenty more of these, and we're going to continue to update this guidance. This deck never settles down. There's always new things coming out. We always want to keep up to date on it. So stay tuned for the future with more stuff coming.
And we'll figure out the screen share on the next one.
Yeah, I have some ideas. I just need more than like 3 minutes to configure it. So for the next one, I think we'll have it figured out.
And we're also giving away a pair of the new architectural speakers in the next training. So definitely, if you guys that are on here want to join us for that next month, it's in our virtual conference center. So join us for that. And Ryan, I can't thank you enough, man. Thank you so much for all your support and helping us today.
Likewise. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, 21st Century. We'll see you guys next month. And until then, take care.
All right. Take care, guys.